In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid these mountains in fear of mysterious death, it became these Superstitious Mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself because I'm very familiar with this area. On the day he was supposed to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. Sam knew it was a bad idea to start this hike so late because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out. But he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. And so he decided he would kind of risk it and just try to go as fast as he could and use the daylight he had to reach a suitable campsite. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark, and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him. And then at one point he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help. And he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting out here are treacherous. No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so as it happened, where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam intentionally did not bring a tent. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But as he's rationalizing this kind of bad gut feeling, a rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock, and immediately he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited. And so for the next 15 minutes, Sam is really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything. He doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so he begins to rationalize and convince himself that there's nothing wrong here. That feeling I have, oh, don't worry about that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way, it's something totally explainable and you got nothing to worry about. And after a little while, he convinced himself and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and he can't find his flashlight. And he's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man, that's weird. I had it right here, right next to my body, and it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head, because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away. Which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately, Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he knows he's not leaving this campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it, and he's not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck is out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood, so unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out, and he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next, because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching, and before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them. And it's still dark outside, and he's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind to whatever's on the other side of those trees. But he knows they're there, and they've stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees. Probably his imagination is going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees, just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved, it turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. And so when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there because he's still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car and he went in and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight?
On the freezing cold night of February 8th, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan sat around this roaring fire with a big group of men inside of this valley in western Colorado. The men around the fire, including Israel, were all gold prospectors, which meant they traveled the western United States looking for gold. But over the past several weeks, this group of prospectors had been trapped in this valley because of all the terrible winter storms. They had these storms coming in that each time would dump up to 6 feet of snow. But on this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire, enjoying the flames and hearing people tell stories, one of Israel's friends, one of the other gold prospectors, whose name was Alfred Packer, he stood up and basically pitched the whole group as to why they should come with him and leave the valley right now. Basically, Alfred told the group that, the weather is starting to turn a bit. It's not as bad anymore. The snow's starting to melt. And Alfred said, I know a pathway out of here that will take us out of this valley in just 2 weeks, and it'll bring us right to Breckenridge, Colorado, which was an area that was known by prospectors for having lots and lots of gold. And so Alfred's basically telling them, this is a win-win. We can get out of here sooner, and we can get rich. After Alfred made this pitch, he sat back down, and everybody just stayed quiet for a second. And Israel, he kind of looked around and watched to see if anybody would take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't like Alfred. They said he was lazy and difficult. But Israel felt like that was really not the reason they did not like his friend. He believed the reason other people did not like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy, which meant he periodically had seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability for journeys like this, where, the whole group really needs to rely on everybody, and everybody needs to pull their own weight. And so they were kind of worried about a guy who at any moment could just become kind of useless because he was having a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy really didn't matter. He didn't feel like Alfred was some huge liability. He felt like Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. And so for him to stand up and make this pitch just kind of felt like in keeping with who he was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to naturally go with Alfred and do his big plan, but he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing out the pros and cons of, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire and he saw one of the men, this really big guy, was sitting there looking really serious and just shaking his head slowly back and forth like, no, you guys can't be considering leaving early. And then the big guy stood up and he held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically telling him, don't say another word. And then this guy, while still looking at Alfred, he said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And then this big guy sat back down again, and then everybody around the fire just sat there really tense for a few seconds in total silence. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different than the rest of the people sitting around this fire. His name was Ure, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabawatch band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Ure had actually saved the lives of everybody, Israel and Alfred included, who was sitting around this fire. Because a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up lost in this valley, which was the valley where Chief Ure lived with his tribe, and he had found them stumbling around on the brink of death with all the snow coming down. And so Chief Ure and his people brought the prospectors some food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river, and then Chief Ure told them to stay put in this campsite and ride out the winter, and then in the springtime, when the snow melts, it'll be safe for you all to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were only thankful and just totally psyched that Chief Ure had found them and given them this campsite. I mean, this was great. And so they had no problem agreeing to, wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being kind of trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried if they didn't leave soon, there'd be no more gold for them to mine. And for Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold, because he had told his family that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. And so he really couldn't go home empty-handed. He literally needed the gold in order to continue to survive and take care of his family. So when Alfred stood up and broke the kind of tense silence and said to Chief Ure, thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early and I just hope others will come with me. At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred, and Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. And so Israel said, you know what? I'll go with you as well. And then after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Ure could tell he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. And so even though he felt like this was a terrible idea, he shifted his focus from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were going to go into. And so he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him, and then Chief Ure drew a map in the dirt on the ground, and he told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that you have to follow the river out of here. It'll bring you to this mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range, and you cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You got to follow that river and go around the mountain range, and then once you do, on the other side, there will be an outpost where you can stop, get supplies, rest, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then after Chief Ure had explained all this, he made sure to mark an X on his dirt map exactly where the outpost would be. And then Chief Ure just turned around and walked over to his horse and rode away. And then shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors who had not volunteered to go with them, who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward and said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go, using his horse. But at some point he would need to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. And so the men were very thankful about this. And so shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they began to see off in the distance the huge jagged mountains of the San Juan mountain range, but they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. And as Israel trudged through the snow in a line of men, he held on to a coffee pot, a metal coffee pot that he kept hot coals inside of. This not only kept his hands warm, but also if he ran out of matches, he could easily start a fire using the coals. It was an old trick he had learned. And so as he's clutching this magnificent warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him, and so he turned around and he saw it was Alfred, and he looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel was. And so without even thinking about it, Israel just handed off his warm coffee pot to Alfred, and Alfred took it and clutched it and was obviously so thankful. Now, none of these gold prospectors had struck it rich. They were all basically poor. But of all these gold prospectors, Alfred really had the least of all of them. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. And also, Alfred was half the age of Israel. Alfred was 30 years old. And so Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid trying to find his way. Alfred had also confided in Israel that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions because he wanted to fight the slave-holding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they kicked Alfred out for his epilepsy. But that had not stopped Alfred from tattooing on his arm his battalion information and his name. And unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he misspelled his name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D. And from that point on, that was his name. Nobody called him Alfred. They called him Alfred. And so this was kind of embarrassing for him. And then after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help. And so after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a flask with some alcohol in it, and he handed it to Israel, almost like a thank you for giving me this warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing back and forth the flask and the coffee pot. And then by late afternoon that day, when the snow was really starting to come down, the prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he had finally reached a point where he said, my horse can't go any farther, the weather's too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies, and then he turned and headed back down the trail. And very likely, as these men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the same thought. I just gotta suck it up for 2 weeks to get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become. 2 weeks would pass by, and Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Ure had pointed out, which was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was going to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by, and still they did not show up at the outpost, and they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving, it was snowing less, but within a couple of days of this group setting off on the trip, those winter storms came back with a vengeance and just dumped snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey was the men themselves, and then also Chief Uray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay in the valley until spring. But even if Chief Uray and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in trouble, they would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley and basically couldn't do anything. And so in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wild, but nobody knew. But that would all change on April 16th, 1874, roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast in one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open, and these officials, they turn around and they see standing in the doorway is this totally disheveled looking guy with long hair that's sticking up in the air and a huge bushy beard. And in one hand, he's got a rifle, and in the other hand, he's got a metal coffee pot. And his eyes were darting like crazy side to side, and he was clearly in shock, and he was trying to speak, but he just couldn't. This man was Alfred. And it was obvious to the officials that this man is in dire need of help. And so without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door, got him some food, got him some water, and immediately Alfred's wolfing down the food as fast as he can until he began vomiting, at which point he apologized profusely and said, I've been starving out in the wild for weeks, and, it must have done something to my intestinal tract, it's probably damaged. But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over the ground. They were worried this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put in warm clothes. And then Alfred asked them, do you have any whiskey? I want to kind of warm my body up. And they said, no problem. They handed him some whiskey. And so Alfred threw a couple of shots back. And then after that, it was pretty obvious that Alfred had kind of relaxed a little bit. And then at that point, one of the officials asked Alfred, what happened to you? As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials that he had been with 5 men and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge, Colorado to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, this huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the trail they were on. And so the group decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range. The thing Chief Uray said, don't do that, do not go over the mountains. They decided to do that. But as they were traversing these treacherous mountains, it was clear that Alfred was just not keeping up with the group. And so unfortunately, they made the decision to leave Alfred behind to die. And he knew he was being abandoned to die. And so he had to watch as his 5 friends, disappeared into the snow. But amazingly, Alfred did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going, eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. And so at night, he was able to start fires. And then also at one point, he was so hungry that he cooked his leather shoes in the fire and ate them because, again, this guy is starving. And so really, he was on the brink of death when he randomly stumbled into this outpost and found this cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive? And they would say no. It's only you. We have not seen anybody else. Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away, mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It's been 2 months since they started that journey. The chances are just not good that they have survived. But even if these other men were not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search because he's the only one who knows where they could be. But Alfred was not healthy enough to go out in the wild and lead a search. And so for several weeks, Alfred just stayed in the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On August 20th, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado, roughly in the area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible smell. And so John followed the smell until it brought him to this clearing, and then in the clearing was what looked like an old beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who was in this campsite, but when he turned the corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze, because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in shock from what he's seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether, and the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lively that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, but he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies, and when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chest, looked surgical, like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away was the remains of a burned out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods, and he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there, but it had all the signs of someone living here for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together, and John realized what he had just stumbled on. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered, and the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This is like a cannibal camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook, he sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was left behind to die, those 5 other men carried on into the night up into the mountains, and then somebody attacked them, began killing them, and eating them. And that person was Alfred. That was why Alfred had survived for so long. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night, it was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even when he killed these 5 men. All we know is that based on the investigation, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered, but the 5th victim, who actually was Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was self-defense and somebody else killed the other 4. It was kind of confusing. Despite those claims he had, the one thing Alfred never denied was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. In fact, when they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But despite it being right there, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 92 years old, he was granted parole, and right away, Alfred became a vegetarian and then died a few years later.
In 1996, Blair Adams was 31 years old and living in Surrey, British Columbia. Although in the past he had struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism, over the previous 2 years he had really gotten his act together and got a great job as a foreman at a local construction company. He was known to be a cheerful and friendly guy that did not have any known enemies. But that summer, Blair started exhibiting uncharacteristic mood swings that his mother would describe as being frequent and wild. In a matter of weeks, Blair transformed from being very calm and relaxed and friendly to being totally panicked all the time and always looking over his shoulder, and he was so stressed out he couldn't sleep at night. And he began telling his coworkers that he was fairly certain someone was trying to kill him. And they would say to him, "Blair, I don't think you're okay. You really need to see a doctor." When his mother confronted him about his erratic, paranoid behavior, he told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." And she said, "What's it?" And he said, "Mom, I can't say anything else." And that was it. She could never get any more information out of her son. Blair's strange behavior came to a head on Friday, July 5th, when he went to his bank and withdrew all of the cash out of his account, totaling $6,000. And he also emptied his safety deposit box, which contained thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold. 2 days later, on Sunday, he left his house and drove 30 minutes to the Canada-USA border, and he attempted to enter the United States. But being a single guy carrying a bunch of cash and jewelry and acting really nervous, he fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and so he was denied entry. Frustrated, Blair left and went back to his house, and the next day, which was Monday, he went to his construction site and he abruptly told his boss that he was quitting. And he didn't even pick up his final paycheck, he just left. After leaving the construction site, he went straight to the airport where he promptly purchased a $1,600 round trip to Frankfurt, Germany. Although we don't know why he wanted to go to Frankfurt, Germany, he did work there briefly the year before. His flight was supposed to leave the following day, which was Tuesday, but immediately after purchasing this plane ticket, Blair suddenly decided that he needed to try again to cross into the USA. So he rushed to a friend's house, he knocked on her door, she opens it up and he looks totally disheveled and he's telling her that someone's trying to kill me, I need your help getting across the border, I just got rejected a couple of days ago, can you please drive me across, you got kids, it'll look much more convincing, can you do that for me? And she was really spooked by his behavior and felt like this is not something I want to get involved with, and so she said, "Sorry, I can't help you." So Blair headed home where he hid out for the day, and then the next day, Tuesday, he went to the airport, but instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, Germany, he went to the front desk and requested a refund, and it was granted. He told them that the person he was going to meet in Germany had gotten sick, and so now he couldn't go. And so the only person he could have been talking about was the girl he had briefly had a fling with when he was there for work the year earlier. But later on, investigators would talk to that German girl, and she would say she was not in touch with Blair, and she definitely was not expecting him. Blair left the airport and rented a car, which was a Nissan Altima, and he immediately went to the US-Canada border, except this time he was able to get across. He made his way to Seattle, Washington, where he went over to their airport, and then abandoned his Nissan in the middle of a parking lot, and then went down and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. Now, he paid $770 for this one-way ticket, but he could have just purchased a round trip for half the the price. But either way, he boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was in Washington, D.C. He got off the plane and rented another car, which was a Toyota Camry, and then drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair was not seen in Knoxville until about 5:30 p.m. that evening when he showed up at a gas station complaining of car troubles. And so the gas station attendant came out to try to help Blair, and he immediately diagnosed what the problem was. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to his Nissan Altima that he had abandoned in Seattle, Washington. And so the attendant pointed out that it was the wrong key, and Blair held it up and said, "No, this is the one I was using." And the guy's like, "No, it clearly says Nissan on it." And so Blair and this gas station attendant look around the car inside and out for this missing Toyota key. Blair's reaching in his pockets. He can't find it. Blair ends up calling the rental company, but they wind up being closed. And so the gas station attendant says, "Unfortunately, we're going to have to tow your car, but I'll give you a ride to a nearby hotel." And so Blair accepted the ride. And just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front door of the Fairfield Inn and then promptly turned around and walked out. And then walked in, and then walked out, over and over again 5 separate times over the course of an hour before he finally walked up to the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk attendant at the hotel said Blair was totally paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, and just totally on edge the entire time. And then after she gave him his room and he paid for it, he took the key, and instead of going up to his room, he just walked out again and then never came back. The following morning, 2 workers arrived at their construction site right across the street from the Fairfield Inn, and they discovered a body, and it would turn out to be Blair's. He was missing his socks, shoes, and pants, and he had scratches on his hands as well as on his face, but none of the abrasions were that significant. There was $4,000 in German, US, and Canadian currencies lying on the ground around him. Also spread out around Blair was his fanny pack full of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold, a black duffel bag that contained maps and receipts, and then also that missing Toyota car key that they could not find the night before. That was lying on the ground as well. Blair's autopsy showed that he had died from a single violent blow to his stomach, but they had no idea what actually struck his stomach. Toxicology reports showed that Blair had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only DNA evidence that was found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was clutching in his fist. But there's no more information about this hair online. There were no witnesses, but there was a security guard who claimed to have heard screaming, a woman's scream, coming from the area where Blair was discovered at about 3:30 in the morning. The only lead police had was the sketch of this guy that apparently people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant right after Blair had left the hotel. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were baffled. Was Blair telling the truth that someone had been trying to kill him for weeks leading up to his death and they finally caught up to him? And if so, why didn't he tell authorities? Or was Blair delusional and he just happened to run into another killer when he was in Tennessee? Unfortunately, we still have absolutely no. By the summer of 2007, Chris had been working as a park ranger in southeastern Pennsylvania for a number of years, and by and large, he enjoyed his occupation. Some of the time, he got to do what he loved, which was hiking in the forest. And some of the time it required doing something he hated, which was office work that usually required staying late at night. On one of those late nights in August of 2007, Chris's boss, Mike, said that he needed to leave the office and go down the access road to this tool shed they had. He needed to get some equipment and bring it back up to the office for some reason, and he said he'd be back in about 15 minutes. As soon as Mike left, Chris decided, you know what, I'm going to take a break from my work and I'm going to step outside for a minute. Right in front of the office building was a little staff parking lot, and then about 50 meters beyond that was the edge of this really dense forest where the access road that Mike had just gone down to get to the tool shed basically split right through the middle and went straight out past the office. When Chris stepped outside to take his break, he sat down on the front steps that overlooked that parking lot and the access road, and he was just kind of looking out towards the forest, not thinking about what he was looking at, just kind of mindlessly sitting there, when all of a sudden he just started to feel like someone's watching me. And instinctively, he turned around to look back into the office, as if maybe someone was behind him, but he remembered that he and Mike were the only ones there that night, so no one's going to be behind him. And so he turned back around and he looked out at the parking lot and he didn't see any movement, and he looked down to the edge of the forest, which he could see because the moon was fairly bright that night, so the illumination was pretty good. And there was no movement against the tree line, there was no animals, there was no people, and Mike had not come back yet. So there's nothing going on in front of him. him, there's nothing going on behind him, but he just could not shake this feeling that someone was watching him. And so Chris, he's not easily spooked. He's used to being out in the forest in the daytime and at night. He's used to being at this office. A lot of times he worked at the office on his own at night. So he's used to this environment. And so he thought, you know what, I'm gonna go look around. And so he walks down the steps and he walks into the parking lot and he begins looking behind some of the cars. There's only a handful in the lot. There's nothing in the lot, and he keeps walking till he's about 10 meters away from the edge of the forest. And he looks into the forest, and it's too dark to see anything, and there's nothing out here. There's no movement, there's no animals. Mike is still not back yet, and so even though he could not shake this sense that someone is watching him, he felt like, you know what, I did my diligence, and there's no one out here, so it's just gotta be in my head. And so he decides he's gonna go back inside. And so he turns around, and he starts walking back up towards the office, when all of a sudden he hears this whooshing sound come past his head. And he didn't know what it was, but it sounded like someone took a stick and threw it overhand, so it's spinning like a tomahawk as it passed by his head. And because the sound was so loud and he was already on edge about someone potentially watching him, that he actually dove as soon as he heard it and fell to the ground and scrambled around and looked at the tree line from where this thing came from, but there's no one there. And he scrambles to his feet and he's still looking around and he starts backpedaling towards the office with his eyes still on the forest, and his attention kind of shifts from the forest to what was just thrown at me. And he turns around and starts walking around looking for something on the ground, like a stick, to see if something really was thrown at him, but he can't find anything. He didn't do an exhaustive search. He didn't look under every single car, but an initial scan turned up nothing. And then he turns back to the forest and he doesn't see anything out there. And even though, again, he feels totally stressed out, like something's out here and I can't see it, he's like, am I going crazy? Did that really happen? Because I can't find this big stick that apparently flew past my head. So is this all happening in my head? But regardless, he's totally freaked out and he sprints back inside the office and locks every door. 20 minutes later, Mike comes blazing up the access road. He stops in front of the office and runs up the stairs. Chris goes over, unlocks the door, and he lets him in. And Chris is about to tell him about this crazy stick throwing incident, but he can tell Mike is really upset about something. Probably more upset about whatever happened to him than Chris is about this stick throwing thing. And so Chris tables his story, he locks the doors behind Mike, and he turns to him and he says, "What's going on? What's wrong with you?" At first, Mike doesn't say anything. He just paces back and forth inside the office. And then finally, Chris calms him down and he gets him to explain what happened. Mike tells him that he was down at the tool shed, which is about a half mile down the access road and about 20 meters off the road into the forest. And he's at the shed, it's open, and he's pulling out the different pieces of equipment he's going to bring back to the office. And he says all of a sudden, all the hairs on his body stand up. He's got goosebumps. And immediately he thinks, someone's watching me. And he turns around and there's no one there. He looks to his right and his left. He kind of pokes his head in the shed, like is someone hiding in the shed? There's no one in there. He walks to the back of the shed. There's no one behind the shed. And he's just totally stumped why he's feeling this way. He goes back to the front of the shed and he's going over in his mind what made him feel this way. And he can't put his finger on it, but he cannot shake this feeling of someone watching him. And it's making him totally anxious. So he gets all the things he needs from the shed as quick as he can. He locks it up, he turns, and he starts speed walking back out to his truck. When he gets about 5 meters away, he hears footsteps running right to left behind him, back where the shed is. And because he was already completely on edge about someone watching him in the woods somewhere, he doesn't even turn around to see what that is. He knows he needs to run to his car and get inside and put steel between him and whatever is out there. Once he's inside, he locks the door, he turns on the ignition and looks one last time in the direction of where he came from. And to his horror, there is a man walking into the woods right next to the shed, turning the corner behind and disappearing into the woods. His instincts were spot on. He was being watched. And that's when Mike hit the gas and sped back to the office. Chris then tells Mike about his stick throwing incident because all of a sudden that seems a whole lot more real, and they both agree that whoever threw something at Chris is probably the same guy who was hiding near the shed with Mike. Concerned this guy might come back and break into the office, they stay the night there and they watch the whole time. They don't see him again. And the next morning they file a report and they tell the incoming park rangers what happened. But after this, there were no more reports of this strange hooded figure roaming around the forest. And to this day, Chris and Mike have no idea who he is or what he wanted. But they can both agree, whoever he was bad news. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. Gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband Mike about this guy Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work, can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. And as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do. And Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target, it, and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory, and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife, and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote "Death to Her" on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder.